The STORM trial really is an important study for a number of reasons. We know that patients have received lots of therapy, and in the context of the STORM trial, they were looking at quad and penta refractory patients, quad meaning resistant to bortezomib, lenalidomide, pomalidomide, and carfilzomib, penta being those four plus daratumumab. And the reason it's so important is despite all the advances we've made in the last decade, there are patients who become penta refractory. And so having treatments that are available and can be effective in that situation is, I think, really important. And what the STORM trial demonstrated was that you could get responses with selinexor and dexamethasone in patients who were penta refractory, and that in many patients, those responses could be quite durable. And so I think it gives new hope and options for patients where their treatment options are often quite limited.
New emerging therapies are badly needed. We were fortunate that only changing one drug into the other one within the class, like proteasome inhibitor, bortezomib, carfilzomib transition, or thalidomide, lenalidomide, pomalidomide transition, have given us so much that we've been, to some extent, spoiled by the availability of new emerging drugs within the class. But we have always thought, and we continue to fight, to bring new classes of drugs. Selective inhibitor of nuclear export, selinexor, have emerged in the last few years, and one of those most promising drugs is now designated as potentially awaiting approval based on FDA designation of the drug, which just tells you that this is drug not only appearing promising at the time when we were starting this drug development, but because of the objective data. Why this drug is different than prior classes of drugs which we use. And the prior class of drugs, in addition to proteasome inhibitors, immunomodulatory drugs, are also cytotoxics, to which, for example, cyclophosphamide belongs, and melphalan for transplant. They are, and steroids were those classes of drugs which we have used before. Selinexor, from this new class of drugs which we are now evaluating, is targeting nuclear export of some important proteins which are involved in malignancy, like, for example, proto-oncogenes. Not going into details of the mechanism of this action, it appears that malignant cells are actively expelling these proteins which otherwise would have potentially worked to eliminate the cell by self-kill, which is called apoptosis. And when we block this exit from the nucleus, the preclinical and then clinical work showed that we may potentially change the chemistry of the disease to again become self-destructive as it's supposed to do in any malignancy. So that was theoretical consideration. We've learned, and studies to this date available in what has been presented or published, that indeed this drug is active on its own, particularly in combination with steroid, which has been used as a basis for submission to FDA for fast track approval path, as well as with other drugs, including proteasome inhibitors, which was predicted preclinically and then eventually validated, at least preliminarily, in the clinical trials.
The STORM trial that was recently presented by my colleague Dr. Jagannath at the SOHO meeting is different from the selinexor study that was published in JCO, in that the JCO article does contain penta-refractory patients, but it was only about half of those 80 patients. Because of the signal that was seen, this study is specifically in patients who have been penta-exposed. And that in itself is kind of interesting because we accrued a lot of patients to this study, but basically the eligibility required exposure to all 5 big myeloma drugs. So we're talking about bortezomib, carfilzomib, lenalidomide, pomalidomide, and daratumumab, or any other CD38 antibody. and then they have to be refractory to each of those classes of drugs. And what's interesting is that when we try to accrue patients to the study, for those patients who are coming in from the community, we may not always be able to document progression per IMWG criteria to show refractoriness. So that in itself was an interesting learning point for enrollment in relapse refractory settings. And it's for that reason the FDA allowed Karyopharm to modify the eligibility to not necessarily require refractory to all 5 drugs, but to each class. So I think that's an important, and it's a really unmet need, because what do you do with these patients? And the second feature I would emphasize with the eligibility criteria here are they were very permissive. So the creatinine clearance only needed to be 20, the neutrophil count only needed to be 1,000, platelets, depending on their bone marrow involvement, if they were heavily replaced, could be as low as 30. So it's important when we look at the toxicity profile, we think about who was getting onto these studies. Pentarefractory, low blood counts, renal dysfunction, and these were rapid progressors, and that should be distinguished from the CAR-T process, which we'll talk about. But unlike CAR-T, patients sign consent for selinexor and dose within 7 to 10 days. And so there's not as much of a selection bias of who's signing consent and actually getting to the infusion. So those are some of the considerations we have to keep in mind when looking at the results of the STORM study that was presented.